I was super excited to talk about the event at Redcaps this past weekend, a 1K which saw a huge variety of decks and an incredibly diverse top 8. And then, as you may be able to tell, I started losing my voice. I was able to get the interview with Craig out as well as my breakdown on Bossk, which got me a top 8 berth. However, this may take a little bit and a few different recordings to get through, but we're going to break down each of the top 8 decks, give you my thoughts on this particular event. Now, first things first, we of course want to at least give a highlight to the incredibly wide field. We are still early in set 2. We haven't even hit Store Showdown season, and there is a huge plethora of options if you want to compete. Now, obviously, not all of them made the top cut, but there was a representation that is shockingly strong. Let's run down the list and explain just how wide this field is. So there was a singular Bossk Green, 1 Cad Bane Red. There were 2 Set 1 Boba Fett's, villain Boba, but 1 was green and 1 was yellow. We also had 2 Set 1 Hans, 1 green, 1 yellow. 3 total young Hans, 2 were blue, 1 was green. Then we had 2 Kylo Yellows, 1 of course was our 5-0, 1 Leia Red, 1 Palpatine Blue, 1 Palpatine Green, a Qira Green, a Rey Red, a Rey Yellow, 4 Sabines that were green, 2 Sabines that were yellow, 1 Gar Saxon Yellow, and 2 Vader Greens. That kind of runs the gamut from aggro all the way to control, including the mid-range, and even some out there things that I would love to see these deck lists, and I'd love to know how they finished on the day. But of course, we do know how at least a subset of these players finished. So we're going to go 8th to 1st and talk about the lists. So first up in 8th place is Young Han Green, this time with ECL. Now, I believe I was looking over this player's shoulder as we were in between rounds, or I was in between rounds, they were still playing, because I do distinctly recall seeing the super laser tech in this list, which is actually kind of cute. It enables a unique resupply, we'll say. I gotta be honest, I'm not really sold on the idea, but I would love to hear from them or your thoughts out there. Let me know down in the comments what you feel about this, because with the Han ability, of course, it immediately dies, so it becomes a resupply. But it's an expensive resupply, so why not just run resupply? I guess you could always ECL it. It is, of course, a body, so it gives you a little more flexibility for the additional cost. I'm not sure I love that, but it obviously got them a top 8 berth, so it's got to be worth something. Notably, there's some other cool inclusions in this deck. We got Reckless Gunslingers, as well as Heroic Renegade, which are much more aggressive options out of a deck that is ostensibly built to ramp. However, we did see this early on in set 2, where there were ideas floating around of, hey, I'm going to play Reckless Gunslinger on 1 with the Han ability. It immediately croaks. Then you can Spark of Hope on turn 1 and get that ramp going literally from the first turn, which is a cool idea. And of course, Heroic Renegade, in conjunction with other options, allows you to apply pressure to, say, control decks, other slower mid-rangey things. Combined with the K2SO and, of course, the Poe Wrecker duo, you can really pour on the damage, and then you top everything off with late game U-Wings and Crate Dragon, and all of a sudden your opponent's in a big hole. Now, we can't ignore the ambushers here, Modded Cohort and Marauder. I think both of those are really cool. I think both of them present some really unique options. I've tried Marauder, admittedly in a different deck. I haven't been a big fan because it felt like the ramp portion never went off. It was fine as a 5-cost ambusher, but the actual ramp itself basically never happened. But I get the sense that this deck probably caught a bunch of people off guard and was able to apply a lot of pressure and then close games out by just slamming a Crate Dragon to just, well, slam the door. Now, beyond that, in addition to the pressure, it does have some reach in the form of tech. Tech allows you to, of course, smuggle anything out of your resource row, and that is, imagine if the card said, pay 3, draw 8 cards. Every deck would play that card, right? What if it was pay 4, draw 8 cards? every deck plays that, right? Tech is absolutely bonkers. If you don't respect Tech, he has to be the card you remove first. You can't let that guy live. Now let's take a look at the board. We get some discard. We do get some anti-smuggle Tech, ironically, speaking of just talking about Tech, in the scanning officer. I didn't realize this guy was a neutral until literally this moment. Because I was running him out of Palpatine and stuff, and it was just kind of, oh yeah, duh, he's got to be a villain. No, he's not. He's just a neutral guy, so he's coming out on. Also have Admiral Akbar, Disabling Fangfighter, and Home 1. There are a bunch of upgrades running around. I was actually just answering a comment on my Bossk video about Disabling Fangfighter. I do like the idea, and it is something that's always kind of on the periphery for me. The Akbars, I could see a world where that makes sense. You're probably going to maintain somewhat of a board. You can ambush in the modded cohort, or even Sundari Peacekeeper off of Energy Conversion Lab into a Sabine opponent, and then Akbar to help kind of stabilize, a little bit of restore, a little bit of removal. An additional threat, big late game bodies. I like this build. This is pretty cool. It's a different take on what I've personally been trying with Young Han Green, but it seemed to perform pretty well. Next up, in 7th place, we have the classic Sabine Green. Honestly, this all seems fairly standard main deck. Notably, I will point out a couple of deviations. We have full set of wing leaders. Some people kind of shave one. Of course, now everybody seems to have settled into accepting that, yes, Darksaber is in fact good enough. Triple Timely, which is something that I think people are starting to walk back from. But Timely Intervention is such a powerful card that I got to respect it. If you want to run Timelies, I'm not going to look at it and go, that's weird, because that makes sense. Notably, X-Wings, I've seen people try other things in this turn 1/2 resource slot, but I personally lean towards the space. My wife also likes that particular version where having the additional space threat, even though it isn't, nobody's super thrilled to have an X-Wing as compared to other options, but it is a rebel. It does fly. It's a pretty solid card. The other notable thing to point out is the particular split of pumps: 2 Metal Ceremony, 2 Rebel Assault, and a single Heroic Sacrifice in the main. Notably, none of those made it to the board, so that you can't switch in, oh, I want more Rebel Assaults because I'm playing a Sabine Mirror, more Heroic Sacrifices because it's control. These are the pumps, and these are the pumps they were comfortable with, so I can respect the commitment. And out of the board, we see Spec Force Soldier. That has fallen off in, we'll say, recent weeks. That I guess there just aren't as many Childsons running around, but with the rise of Qira, I can definitely see why it found its way back into the board, because certain versions, namely the 30 health KTOD version, is running Childson, and of course there's Pike Sentinels and other random Sentinels floating around. Sundari Peacekeeper clearly is a mirror breaker or other aggro mirror breaker, and the card is bonkers. I didn't give it enough attention looking at the last list, but Sundari Peacekeepers is actually a real pain in the neck for a variety of decks. The 5 health is fairly chunky, and the restore really does add up. It's one of those cards that, again, if you let it get rolling instead of removing it early, you're going to suddenly realize too late that it was the core of the problem. Disabling Fangfighter, shocker, more anti-Darksaber tech, probably going to show up, definitely makes sense. The most interesting thing in this list is the last 2 sideboard slots, and that's Traitorous. I don't think I've ever seen a Sabine list include this prior to this point. I'm sure I've seen one. I would love to know how often those got boarded in and where, because you could kind of see it in the mirror, like, oh, I just completely disrupt your turn. Maybe against control, because it's, oh, you plop down some Sentinel, I'm just going to take it and clear a path. But in both scenarios, it feels like in the mirror, and when I say mirror, we're talking a whole aggro matchup, wouldn't you be better off spending those resources just killing them? And there's got to be better removal options to remove Sentinels or other annoying things. So I'm curious what this was targeting in particular. But again, they hit top 8, and you can't complain about any event that you top 8. 6th place, another oldie but a goodie, Boba Yellow. This was the deck that I personally played to a top 8 in top 8 for the Redcaps 1K in set 1, and a number of top 8s and a win in Showdown. I love this deck. I didn't love it going into set 2, or at least beginning with set 2, but we have some sweet and spicy tech showing up here. Leaning into the space route, which is something that a variety of builds, whether it was Boba it was Kylo, it was even IG-11, or excuse me, IG-88, or a variety of other things, whether it's red, it's yellow, it's both, it's whatever. A lot of things are trying out triple dark raid, and it's actually pretty cool here. There's a lot of things, though, to discuss, so let's get into it. We got a full set of a new adventure, which is a card that is very love-hate among the boba community. People that play it swear by it. People that don't play it are like, this card is doo-doo. Why are you playing it? Why do you have it? It's win more, or it's not even win more. It's just dirtle. But you can definitely see the explosive potential here, and notably, keep this in mind, for those of you that aren't aware, if you triple dark raid something to play and then you a new adventure it stays in play, which is pretty sick. And of course, there are other targets, not just the triple dark raid targets. Hitting, say, Bodhi Rook or Cantina Bouncer or whatever against certain matchups, that can be absolutely crippling. Oh, you land Bodhi Rook and you take their ramp, and they're like, all right, well, I'll just overwhelming barrage you in a couple turns. No, you won't. And Bouncer, of course, makes sure, because anybody who's played Boba Yellow has had that scenario where it's, well, I could bounce their Sentinel, but they're just going to replay it. So I'm in this awkward spot of like, I want to do it, but I don't really want to do it, but I have to do it. Well, guess what? You can bounce it twice. This is an extra copy of all of these different cards. It also, of course, can reset damage, keeping Forlom and Zuckuss alive for the other one, as long as they don't just die to state-based effect, that sort of thing. Notably, also, the last two cards in the main deck are also super spicy. ATST, because remember, Triple Dark Raid isn't just spaceships. The art can be misleading. And also, Final Showdown. Sick. I love it. This was the only Boba Yellow player in the event, so I was watching them while their game was going on. It was on my stream. You can check that video out. The sideboard extra Bazines, definitely see where that's coming in. Pick off those OBs, pick off those SLBs, pick off those Snokes, pick off whatever. The Boba armor is pretty cute because a lot of Boba lists have been skipping Boba armor, mine included. And, well, I've had it in some, I've cut it in others, and it's interesting. I do like it. I think there's potential here, especially here where the Boba is significantly more exposed on the ground than it would in other lists. Yeah, you can still waylay, you can still cunning, you know good to be dead, whatever, but you don't have as much of the ground pound in order to maintain board position there. So it's possible that you get overrun on the ground, and slamming a Boba's armor onto a prepared leader, a deployed leader, means that it's actually going to stick around. Relentless Pursuit is pretty cool. I have seen copies of it in main decks. I usually run one personally. Additional removal, sometimes you just got to get rid of things. The No Bargain is actually pretty cool. Control decks have been a struggle for Boba Yellow in the past. I'd be curious if it actually is for this version, because between Triple Dark Raid itself as well as Lurking Tie, you should be able to present a significant threat to your slower control opponent, a challenging set of threats. But the No Bargain allows for additional pressure, so I think that's really cool. Now in 5th place, what's got 2 thumbs and a lizard man leading his team? That's this guy. If you want to check out my thoughts on this, I did an entire video on it. The real quick is, Bossk is a lot of fun. You will almost never feel more powerful than when you complete Bossk and double up a bounty. But sometimes the deck just does not want to compete. So, check out that other video. All right, in 4th place, we have Boba Green, another classic. Now, I believe this was one of the Golden Dice guys, so shout out to them. They were also streaming the event, so we were getting multiple games, although we both missed round 1 for different reasons, so it happened. Either way, this is a rather unique version of Boba Green. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't really kept up with it as much as I did in set 1. Once it started falling off in set 1, I didn't pay as much attention in set 2. I kind of came back to it, but then drifted away because I really wanted Boba Yellow to work. But there's some interesting stuff going on here. I mean, it is, I would say, more aggressive because we do have the mercenary gunship, and it's also hitting the top end with Maul rather than the previous Vader. Additionally, we do have a unique split on the Forlom and Zuckuss, namely 2 Forlom and 3 Zuckuss. That's actually pretty cool because you usually see it the other way around. Obviously, Zuckuss has a lot of utility against a variety of things. It's cheaper, it has the native ambush, and you would expect less copies of Zuckuss because it's more expensive. But supplementing it with Syndicate Lackeys means that you do have, I guess, the appropriate density of ambushers. And here's where it always gets interesting, is that we have 2 recruit and a single shoot first. And you can see throughout the list, we have the Singleton Relentless Pursuit, for example. There's somewhat strange numbers across the board, or at least strange if you aren't familiar with the list. So the recruit is a callback to set 1, and I do like something in this position. I'd be curious if this particular player had tested, say, commission for the smuggle aspect, because I think you can fetch a bunch of stuff from this deck if it's, unless I'm thinking of the wrong card. But either way, recruit fits in, you have spare resource because of a boba on tap. Great, I'm going to go try and draw some cards. The shoot first, I guess, is just a potential blowout where it's, yeah, I just snipe something unexpectedly. And of course, your opponent has to be playing, whether you do it to them once or not, they kind of have to think and consider the shoot first being in there, so you can easily manipulate their plays and influence what their decisions are, especially if you do it in game 1. You game 1 shoot first something, your opponent's going to be thinking about that for the rest of the match. So the top end, calling back to the mall, just want to point that out again. There are a number of other underworlds in here. I mean, you got Greedos, you got the gunships, the spacers, the crafties, the bobas themselves, Syndicate Lackeys, Forloms, like everything but what the super laser tech is underworld. I guess 7th Fleet as well. Huge number of targets, actually way more than I was running in Bossk for redirection. So that mall is pretty much always going to come out and be unscathed after the combat, which is pretty cool. He's a big, beefy threat, and he's going to close the game out quickly. So I definitely love the underworld sub-theme, we'll say, or maybe it's the dominant theme in this particular list. Now on the board, we get McClunkies. Looking at the aggro matchup there alongside the Consortium Star Vipers. We do have the extra resupply and reinforcement walkers, as well as the Emperor's Legion. Some of those will give you additional late game control. This is one of the debates that I distinctly recall having with people in set 1 of whether reinforcement walker is worth it against aggro, because it is entirely possible the game is just way, way over before it hits the board. So I'd love to hear this player's thoughts on whether this actually was for aggro or it was for something else. Next up in the top 4, 3rd place specifically, is Gar Saxon. This deck was kind of the talk of the town. I did talk to this player after the event and said, hey, hit me up in Discord. I would love to get an interview. So if they're watching this, hit me up in Discord. RTChompGG. I'd love to talk to you about this deck because this is really cool. And I know there's a number of Gar enjoyers, we'll say, out there that were salivating when they saw this on stream. Now, I was on stream against this deck and I did lose. I got cooked. There's just no two ways about it. That very well played by my opponent. So it is an aggressive list, and there's a number of things that are probably going to shock somebody initially and go, but how is it aggressive and it's running the client? Well, guess what? Shields are an upgrade. Experience is an upgrade. All of those things give +1/+0, and there is a freakish amount of buffs in this deck. You're looking at DL44, Snapshot, Jetpack, Surprise Strike, Shoot First. There's a huge number of ways to go, yeah, just oops, you're dead. And it's even funnier because most of the units protect themselves in one way or another. As mentioned, the clients, 7th Fleet, Dr. Evazan, Lam Pike, Super Commando Squad, Shields, and Cargo Juggernaut, Shields galore. Then, of course, Survivor's Gauntlet can hand out experience as well as Val. Just make sure if you're playing this deck, you're ordering your triggers properly. And then, naturally, Lurking TIE Phantom lurking and ensuring that your control opponents are going to have a bad day. You have to answer this thing quickly, and I'll be honest, I'm sure all of us have seen what Lurking TIE Phantom can do at this stage. So as for the board, we get Devotion, Bazine, the extra Lurking TIE, Calculated Lethality, and Fell the Dragon. Most of these seem fairly obvious for what they're going to be targeting. Starting from right to left, Fell the Dragon, of course, any big control threats. There's a number of things that would probably concern this deck at the very least, and being able to remove them cleanly allows you to close the game out or clear a path depending on what the scenario is. So the Calculated Lethality is something that, as mentioned, I would love to interview the person for this that piloted this deck, but that is actually pretty unique to me because it is a costly removal card. It does synergize with, oh, well, I'm essentially giving one of my guys +2/+1 if you can get the experience trigger, but I'm not sure. I'm guessing it's coming in against aggro to help break some of the parity there. But I wonder if you're able to do that baseline anyway. You know, most of your guys eat their guys profitably because of the shields, because of the experience, because of the buffs, because of whatever. So is it really necessary? I mean, this player felt so. So I'd be curious to hear more about that. Now, the third lurking tie is actually a little surprising to me. I would have thought that the tie would have been main, maybe cut a Survivor's Gauntlet or one of the Juggernaut, but I also didn't pilot this deck, and I also lost to it, so what do I know? I think the ties can be in there, but maybe there just wasn't room, and there was concerns about, given that the Cargo Juggernauts, I mean, they're shielded to begin with, but maybe there's a concern about aggro there. I'm not sure. The Bazines clearly are coming in to snipe particular things. We talked about it in the context of other decks. Overwhelming Barrage probably is less of a threat to this than it is to many other decks due to the quantity of shield, but that isn't the only thing to be concerned with. We already talked about SLB, we already talked about Snoke, but there are other ways to disrupt your opponent where it's just, hey, I Bazine and I take your turn for this, like I take your play for this turn. And if your opponent just has to go, all right, I guess I claim, you're very happy about that, especially with a list as aggressive as this. And lastly, Devotion. Clearly, this is coming in against other aggro decks, and it's an upgrade, so it's getting further buffs, it's getting the restore. A lot to love about that. Now, in second place, we have what was the most recent terror of the tournament scene, and that is Qira. Green-blue villain is back. Don't call it a comeback. It's always been here. This particular list is featuring the 30 health base. It's also sporting some pretty cool spice in here as well. Notably, even though I mentioned it earlier, there are not Childsons in this list. If you were taking the KTOD version, they are, or were running, maybe they changed it, they were running Childsons at the time for Gen Con. It seems to have been excised for this particular list, notably in favor of techs, which are pretty sweet. Again, we talked about this earlier in the context of the Han deck, but this gives you a draw 8, which is just insane. Of course, your opponent has the opportunity to remove it, but if you play this and it's like, if you untap with tech in play, I imagine it's almost impossible to lose the game because you just drew 8 cards. Like, it can't be possible for you to lose the game. Not with a control deck. Moving on from tech, though, because I've gushed about him enough, we do have some interesting numbers. There's a lot of 2-ofs. So we have to look at the list more holistically. Is it that we have X number of removal cards because we have Power, Make an Opening, Vigilance, Takedown, and Fell the Dragon, as well as Overwhelming Barrage, and of course, the units themselves. But it is pretty interesting to see that, for example, there's only 2 Death Troopers. That's something that you kind of expect there to be a full play set of, but clearly worked out here. The late game has kind of solidified for these decks, leaning into Snoke, but still sporting some Star Destroyers in order to supplement everything. Notably, 5 7-cost ambushers, 2 Darth, 2 Maul. Actually really cool here. There's a ton of targets. Getting the client off of Vader can be absolutely bonkers, but sometimes you just want to close the game out, or you need 7 damage to remove something. Either way, you have a ton of ways to deal with any significant threat that your opponent presents. You just kind of have to play around and make sure you play around Great Dragons. Now, looking at the board, let's start with the bottom part. So, Devastator and Relentless, as well as Palpatine's Return, clearly going, and there's other stuff. Spark of Rebellion, Extra Vigilance, and Rivals Fall. I have to imagine all of these are more geared towards control matchups, although they could have value elsewhere. So, Star Destroyers and Palpatine's Return are obvious. Rivals Fall can double as, hey, you're a leader load up deck, Boba's armor, that sort of thing. I need to remove that thing. Or the aforementioned Great Dragons. Look, it's got to go. Got to remove it. The Vigilance, in lieu of restock, can give you the middle game plan against control, but the problem there is, well, it's not a problem, but I think you're, as Wu stated, much better off just, hey, I have more Star Destroyers than you, and I have Palpatine's Return to get them back. That's before you consider Palpatine's Return on Vader or Maul, or even Snoke. There's a lot of different ways that you can present a considerable board and just basically crush a control deck. However, adding Spark of Rebellion on that means that you can really shred their hand, really make sure that they are incapable of setting up their particular game plan, and just disrupt them in general. And the top targets seem to be, unless you count the Vigilance, the only anti-aggro tool that is in here. In speaking with a lot of Qira players, they feel that the aggro matchups are the weakness. Everything else they felt comfortable against, but sitting down across from Sabine always had them sweating. And I absolutely understand that. The top targets are a unique way to try and deal with that. Given that it is on aspect, as compared to like when I was running it out of aspect in Bossk, this is a pretty cheap heal. And while you can't get the heal for 12 that you can by doubling up with Bossk, healing for 6 is still a significant amount. And it's a 30 health base, and you have Vigilance, and you have the client, and you have all this other stuff to either lock down the board, remove their things, or close the game out quickly. I can definitely see where just that's almost an entire turn worth of damage, depending on what turn we're talking about. It can buy you an enormous amount of time. Last but not least, we of course have our first place finisher. And again, thank you to Craig. This is a really cool list, but like I said, you got to go watch the other one if you want the full thoughts. It's better to hear it directly from Craig as to how and why the list looks like it does. Well, that's all of the top 8. This was an incredible event. Thank you to Redcap's Corner for hosting once again. I hope that they are able to run more of these events in the future because this is a lot of fun. It's great to get everybody together and play some Star Wars Unlimited. I'm looking forward to the Showdown season as well as the Qualifier season. All of these lists are incredibly inspirational, and I hope that they gave you some ideas. Let me know what your thoughts are on these particular lists and what you think about them down in the comments. But that's going to do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Random's Thoughts.